Next up is um, James Hunter, who is a third generation caver or lech caver. He has, when I first met him, he was just this tall, quiet dude with a shy smile. And then I discovered he had a really wicked sense of humor. With that, James, I'll let you carry on.
Okay, can you just confirm you're hearing me, Pat?
Yes, perfect.
Great. So I'm James Hunter. I'm going to talk about caving in or climbing in an underground wilderness. I got the quintessential picture of Lechuguilla, and I try to give credits to all the photographers when I use their photos. So here's the list. Hopefully I got that correct. I tried to label them all. If I made a mistake, I'm sorry, but I do really appreciate all the photos for this. Just a quick overview. I'm going to give a background, talk about climbing, gear, people, and climbs, recent discoveries that involved climbing. Not going to talk much about Never Never Land. That wasn't my climb and I wasn't on the trip. I'm hoping Ron will talk about that later. And then a quick note on impact and safety, and just finishing up with what the next climbs could be. So this talk, Lechuguilla is a complex three-dimensional cave. I think most people know that, but it's hard to appreciate until you've been there. Climbing's been a part of the exploration of Lech from basically the beginning. This talk's not that history. This talk is my experience since I started climbing in 2007 in the cave. And so it's really focused on the last 50 miles. I first went to Lechuguilla in 2007, so John's talk was actually a great lead into that. The discovery of Emerald City happened on that trip, so it was a pretty great trip to start out with. And I actually free climbed the first pitch of what was eventually named the Kansas Twister. So John's last few photos were after I climbed that pitch, and I'm showing looking up the start of the Kansas Twister, and this is the start of the slope up to where that dome photo was taken. And it's about 100 feet up to this arch, and then we could disto about 100 feet above that. And this is really what started my interest in climbing in Lech. Emerald City had a bunch of good looking shorter climbs as well as the big one. So I've been involved in dozens of climbs in Lechuguilla. Everyone hears about the ones that go. There's a couple of those. The vast majority of them either went a few feet or didn't go at all. And that's the reality of climbing. And somehow, I agree to a trip and I'm usually regretting it when I'm looking at a crappy wall of rock and I tie in, and then somehow 6 months later, someone sends me an email and says, hey, we got this climb, you want to go back? And I'm going back carrying climbing gear and not thinking about tying in for those first few moves. I like to include this because I don't know, I got to assume most people on this event have been in Lechuguilla, but everyone asks, how can you go? What does it take? And this quote from Derek Bristol, I think, is the most concise, polite summary I've ever seen. And it's really worth a read. Develop the fitness to cave with a 40-pound pack and cave for 12 hours a day for 8 straight days. Become proficient in IRT, and that's indestructible rope technique. If you're not familiar with it, it's used a lot in Lech. In European rigging and rope work, become a proficient surveyor, strong conservation ethic, show that you can work hard with a positive attitude and get to know the cartographers and expedition leaders. Bonus points for being a good sketcher, aid climber, and cave photographer. And I just want to put in perspective, I'm talking about aid climbing in the cave, but it's part of a much bigger picture. Okay, so one of the real tricks of climbing is that we start out every trip now with a lecture from the park about our goals and our priorities. The absolute top goal is safety. There's nothing that trumps safety. If we feel we're in a situation where we would be taking a significant risk of injury, we have to back off and reassess and not do that. The next goal is low impact. So if we might break a great formation, if we're going to have significant impact to the cave, we need to stop. And finally, our preferred goal as cavers is new exploration, and that's really third priority. And climbing is a tough to fit in here because you can seriously hurt yourself. And a lot of climbing ethics in the outdoors are about how bold you can be, how far you can push it. And we don't typically worry so much about impact in outdoor climbing. Cave climbing in Lechuguilla is different than this. The priority is safety. And after that, can we minimize impact? If the impact's too high, either the park won't approve it or we need to back off ourselves. And so it really is a balancing act that has a different set of ethics than outdoor climbing. And this is just showing a quick example of why we climb, right? I assume there'll be another talk on this, but this is the first day of survey in the Oz complex after 5 days of climbing. Okay, so I talked about this a little bit, but our goal is to get into a lead in the safest, lowest impact fashion possible. We're in a wilderness area. This means we're not allowed to use a power drill. That's a much debated, is it a good idea, at least among the cave climbers, but I would personally say at the end of the day, there's been far less impact because of that. Safety is preeminent. Rescue is difficult to impossible. We'll hear more about that. We've been told repeatedly, if we have a bad accident, it may shut down exploration in the cave. And so what this leads to is we'll cheat in any creative way possible that makes it safer and reduces impact. And, the rule of thumb, at least for myself and the people I climb with, is you should climb like you should never fall. So in 13 years and probably, 30 or 40 climbs, I've seen 3 or 4 actual lead falls in the cave. That's a very small number for the type of climbing we're doing. And to my awareness, in the time I've been going, there's been 1 serious injury, a broken arm, and I believe that's talked about later in the weekend as well. And then on top of all this, people we're going with really don't like carrying climbing gear. And so, in fact, it's like one of their least favorite things as far as I can tell. So we really have to minimize gear due to that haul distance. And the final thing is that most climbs in Lechuguilla aren't climbs. It's a 3-dimensional maze, and in the majority of cases, you can actually get around and get to the top. And so one advantage of requiring people to do aid climbing and hand drill bolts is we work really, really hard to avoid a climb before we actually start climbing. And that's led to a lot of situations where a bypass was found. And that's just a photo of Derek getting ready to rack up for a climb I'll talk about later. So gear, I like this photo. This was the entire rack that was used to climb Kansas Twister on the final push up. I believe it's the last 6 pitches. So we do have a hand drive bolt kit we're allowed to use if there's no other option. And if you haven't drilled a bolt into solid limestone by hand, it's a good exercise, I would say. Typically maybe 10 to 30 minutes to place that bolt, and you're usually hanging on a bad piece of gear. So this is not easy, it's not fast. We use removable bolts, though these have become somewhat less common. So these little orange guys right here are a little sort of wedging device that you can put in and then remove from a bolt hole, and that's lower impact, and the orange ones are 1/4 inch, so it's fast. A few people use 1/4 inch bolts. Those are not really my favorite tool, but some do. Then recently, we figured out, I think it was actually probably Ron and Art that realized this, there's a type of sleeve bolt that if you're clever, you can tap back in after you use it and then use a set of pliers and remove it. And so I've switched to primarily using those as 3/8 inch stainless steel bolts. They're a huge step up in safety compared to the old wire removable bolts. We use hooks and pitons, we use trad slings. Obviously we use dynamic rope and then static rope and a tag line for rigging afterwards. I'll show some link cams, and then aliens, if you're not familiar, are a type of small cam. Cams are we use them, but not as much because the level of dirt and the poor rock quality really hurts. We use tri-cams, which are a slick little sort of active nut, I guess I would say. These work very well in pockets, which are ubiquitous in the cave. And then obviously we use aiders and ladders. And typically, I think it's down now to where we usually have about 12 pounds of hardware, including the bolt kit, and then usually 4 or 5 pounds for a 200-foot rope. So we stay below 20 pounds for our entire selection of equipment. And we also put some effort into keeping it clean. So this is Stan Allison, Larry Schaefer at the bottom of the Capitol Dome climb we named Big Naturals that John showed the finding of in the Far East. So, continuing with gear, cave rock tends to be poor quality, what we call crap, and it can be quite bad in Lechuguilla, like you can rip pieces off with your hands. It's not crack climbing. This is not like Moab. It's pocket-based, and the airflow corrodes the rock. So in general, this whole exercise is how do you find good enough rock to hold you up to keep climbing? It's just, it's really management of rock quality. We're forced to climb where the leads are. We don't look at a wall and go, oh, that's good rock, we should climb that. We look at a lead and go, well, we're gonna have to deal with the poor rock that's there. And because airflow corrodes rock, sometimes the best lead has the worst rock. I should say, I'm giving my perspective. Climbers' gear tastes really vary, and people use fairly broad methods and varieties of gear, and they all work. We steal tricks from each other, but at the end of the day, it's an individual pursuit. I have 3 personal favorites. Pitons are incredibly useful. If you can find a little seam, frequently the rock quality is such that you can You can pound a piton in and then you can remove it afterwards. Also like link cams, which not a lot of cavers are familiar with, but they're sort of the most advanced camming device. Shown a picture down here on the bottom right. These are cams that actually split into 3 sizes. This has a huge advantage when you're dealing with pockets and uneven areas, so it can expand to large on one side and then stay small on the other. And so it's kind of an irony to me that I use pitons, which are one of the oldest pieces of climbing gear in existence, and I use link cams, which are one of the newest pieces. So it's really just about what works. And there's a picture of these stainless 3/8 inch sleeve bolts that can be removed. You can actually get these in 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. These things are really nice. And John already showed this, but there's no such thing as cheating as far as I'm concerned. If you can get up safely and you can minimize impact, that's it. So John had a slick name for this, like the rock caster or something, but is a slingshot with a fishing reel inspired, I believe, by ham radio guys that was used successfully on Kansas Twister. And we've used this sort of method since we get a fishing line over and then pull up a small cord and then pull up a rope. Okay, traditionally, climbers name climbs. It's one of the things we do. And so usually when you get to the top of the climb, you give a name, and that sort of pins down what it was. And so the bigger climbs I'm going to talk about all have names, and usually those names don't make it on the map. This, I believe, is actually a room called Polar Circus that we just called the Polar Circus climb. Max might correct me on that. But that's one of the only cases where I know the climbing name actually made it on the map. So I'm just going to go through sort of some examples and photos of the various climbs. The first one, John introduced very nicely, the Big Naturals climb, which is in the Capitol Dome off the Far Easter. It's 150 feet. It was 6 days of climbing with Larry Schaefer, myself, and Stan Allison. You'll notice for some reason all our climbs seem to take 5 to 6 days. It's like having a deadline. So 6 days is the longest we can be in working. Having a deadline seems to make us finish things. The Kansas Twister, I'll talk about a little bit, but this is a much bigger story that multiple talks cover, so I'm not going to dwell on it. It's a multi-year effort, 3 smaller climbs, and then a 5-day, 300-foot push. It was actually named after someone got over that arch, which is not traditional, but the name stuck anyway. Polar Circus, I just mentioned on the map, 150 feet, 3 days of climbing. Derek led most of this. I did a little bit. The Treehouse climb up to Never Never Land is a Ron and Art climb. I'm really not going to cover it, but it led into a decent-sized breakout, so it's one of the successful ones. Space Shot's actually quite recent in Zion in the far west. There will be a talk on the discovery of Zion. This is a 3-day climb, all clean. By what I mean, actually 2 things. We climbed it clean. We did not drill bolts. And then in addition, we wore all clean gear. This didn't go, but it is really neat. Boulder Dome is actually 10 minutes inside the cave, maybe. It's directly above Boulder Falls. People have been walking under this since the discovery of the cave, and was done over 6-day trips by myself, and Steve Egenwar, a cave photographer, helped with that as well. And then the most recent climb was higher education in the PhD room. It's a 220-foot climb, 6 days of climbing, Derek Bristol and myself. So with that, let's get to it. So Big Naturals, it's this huge room on the northeast edge of the cave. John showed that. Very challenging overhanging climbing. Larry Schaefer led a section of what we called snowball gypsum. You couldn't reach the bedrock. It was just these balls of gypsum. It's actually right here was the bad section. I don't know if people can see my mouse or not, but hopefully it's on the right photo about halfway up. Larry led this by wrapping 6 of these gypsum balls and trusting that. And so it's an impressive and difficult lead. At the very top was one of the worst lips we've ever encountered. It was basically a knife blade sticking out about 6 feet. And yeah, that really shows it. And this is what Stan, Larry, and I looked afterwards. We were honestly a little bit beat up. And the one thing I should mention here is belayers are the unsung heroes. So a lot of cavers will belay a climb even though they don't climb. And if you can imagine sitting at the bottom of a climb for 6 days, watching other people climb and either being really bored and trying not to fall asleep, or terrified because you think they're going to fall or they're dropping rocks around you, belayers are the reason we're able to climb in caves, and they deserve a lot of the credit. So a little more on Big Naturals. One of the key things in cave climbing, so we go up, we fix an anchor, we come back down, we go up the next day. If we get a ledge, we're lucky, we move our belay up. But rope management is critical, and these 2 photos on the right show that. This is the bottom of the Big Naturals climb looking up with, I think, 2 static ropes, our dynamic belay rope, and a tag line. And this is where it's not our anchor. This is just where we've tied off all the pieces to help keep track of them in the middle. And then John actually showed this image, which is funny to me because this is a photo of one of, I think, like half a dozen climbs Stan and I did on that trip. Didn't go anywhere, fun climb. You can see that's actually a 1/4-inch removable bolt. It's the first piece of gear down from the photo. So that's climbing in the Far East on the Big Naturals climb. Kansas Twister is probably the best known of the recent climbs. Started actually in 2007. I mentioned this when I climbed this, what I called pitch 1. It's actually a free climb. I might not do today. I'd probably do it with gear. But it was like a 65-degree slope up to a decent landing. 2008, Matt Covington and I went back, and we knew we were going to want to try something like a slingshot. So we did a short pitch up to, in the center photo, you can see this bright spot. We did a short pitch up there to give us an angle where we could actually stand a chance of getting the slingshot over that arch. And yeah, that was what I called pitch 2, just because it was critical to doing the next section. Pitch 3 was the slingshot, and that was, I can't remember, 2009 or 2010. John and I went back and tried it, and we couldn't get our larger cord over. It kept getting stuck. So in 2010 or 2011, another team returned and succeeded in getting a cord over and getting a rope up. And so they ascended to that arch, put in an anchor, climbed up, I believe, 1 bolt, and then they backed off. We were told due to loose rock. I don't know if that's correct or not. Then in May 2012, this guy, Derek Bristol, I'd never caved before, contacted me because someone had bailed and said, hey, you want to go? We're going to try this climb you were involved in. So I went back and spent 5 days with Derek completing the upper 6 pitches of the climb. This is some of the loosest and crappiest rock I've ever encountered. That first pitch off the arch, I spent, I don't know, an hour cleaning loose rock maybe before I was able to move higher. And it was so long, we used every single rope left in camp. And then the last piece of rope was about 5 feet short of this huge natural at the top. So we used 2 pieces of personal webbing tied around that natural for the final anchor. And the photos here just show some of the climbing process. You can see on one of our belay ledges, rope management continues to be a key thing. The Kansas Twister, so this is looking at the last 2 pitches. This is this sort of infamous upper rock layer in the cave that is just horrible. It's full of clay, it's corroded. So, you know, the first time I sat on a cam and it just ripped completely out and took the rock with it, I was kind of freaked out. By the end of these pitches, it was normal. We expected that would happen, and we'd test and work our way through cam sizes and eventually find something that worked. We did quite a bit of hooking between placements, which really helped with progress. And after this horrible sequence of gear, somehow the final piece was a little crack covered in crystals that a piton just went into beautifully, and that let me free climb to what turned out to be the top. And you can also imagine our gear gets pretty muddy here. And so after 6 days, your gear sort of starts to have trouble functioning. And yeah, you can, it turned out on this climb, our belayers were also typically a little freaked out. I think Roger Harris's expression here shows it. We were dropping a fair bit of loose rock, and we sort of went through belayers quickly. We'd change a person every day just because people got nervous watching us climb. And the rock was never close to hitting people, but it would whistle past you in the big dome, which was quite disconcerting. So that, you know, people will talk more about Oz and what was found at the top of Kansas Twister. Then we did the Polar Circus climb, which Max is going to cover the discovery of Neuland, but this was at the end of it. Derek did most of this climbing. I did 1 pitch at the top. Total dead end, which was a bitter disappointment to Derek because Kansas Twister was one of his first climbs in the cave. And I'm showing Derek after our gear was kind of dirty at this point, so he's making a nasty expression at it. And then this is a photo just of tossing the rope at the top. And that is one of the most satisfying things when, you know, you're beat up, you're tired, usually you're a little scraped, and you get to rig an actual static rope and just rappel down and plan on climbing it again. It's a great feeling. And then Space Shot, this is probably the coolest climb I've done in the cave or been involved in. It's a flowstone cascade off the main room in the recent Zion discovery. We climbed all in clean gear, so aqua sock sort of things, you know, clean pads, clean gloves. We used, I believe it was 1 aid move off a hook, and otherwise it was a total free climb, no bolt placements. It was something like 4 pitches. Derek and I traded off each day. I think the pictures give you an idea. This was hands down the funnest and prettiest climb I've done. There was one good side passage, but otherwise it was a total dead end. Just a few more photos of that. So on the left, there's just these spectacular wind eroded draperies. There was a photo on the previous slide, and that's Ellen Whittle and Beth Courtright there. You know, someone got to belay from that ledge for, you know, half a day looking at these formations on the next pitch. And then up near the top, there's this interesting wind eroded stalagmite you can see on the right, kind of a marbled appearance with Ellen behind it. And there's quite a bit of wind erosion here, which is curious because there was no airflow we could feel at all. So it's like this eventually sealed itself off, but at some point it had more airflow. Okay, Boulder Dome, this is actually kind of working out from where I started. A few minutes, like 10 or 15 minutes inside the entry of Lechuguilla, you hit Boulder Falls, which has been described in the past talks. It's like the signature pit. It's sort of the hardest thing, maybe not the hardest, but one of the difficult things you do with a camp pack going in. I don't know how many, you know, hundreds or thousands of people have walked under that or walked over to this, but directly above it, there's actually a black hole in the ceiling. And so I was bored waiting for some video guys. And so I got my disto out and was able to disto up 200 feet. And the ceiling looks like it's maybe 50 there. So this really piqued my interest, and I put in a request to climb this on day trips. So over a few years, I climbed this dome with Steve Egenwar pitching in on one of the leads. And on the right, you can see a photo of the climb. It's about the first 2/3 of the climb. Steve Egenwar at the bottom. He's actually on the main trail, like that's the orange flag double trail. First big ledge we got to, arch we went over. There's Beth Courtright hanging, you know, I don't know, 50 feet up, maybe 40 feet. And then up above that is Nikki Woodward on rope. And so it was just amazing to me. There was this big a lead, this big a climb right inside the cave. And it ended up being about 213 feet to the top. It's actually above the entry level, but there's a point in the wooden lettuce passage that's a little higher, so it didn't actually make the cave taller in this case. And it ended with a short but pretty passage named Purple Rain. And then to the left, one of the things I like about climbing is you can look down and get the bird's eye view. And so there's a bird's eye view looking down on the main trail approaching Boulder Falls. I'll just let people look at this photo for just a second. This was Steve Egenwar in the Purple Rain pool. And it, you know, yeah, the lead didn't really go anywhere, but this is still one of the prettier spots I've seen at the top of the climb. And it seems reasonable. There's always this, the weird gurgling sound that occurs periodically when you're sitting usually at the bottom or at the top of Boulder Falls, you can hear. This pool is very close to the surface and presumably varies water level a lot. So it would not surprise me if something in here in the water flow is where that gurgle sound originates from. Okay, and I think this is the last climb I'm going to talk about. This is actually covered in the NSS News, which people hopefully got in the mail in the last few days. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's a PhD room climb. This is on Hazel Barton's quad, and she's been bugging Derek and I to say, hey, could we do this? And we finally got it together about a year ago and did the climb. It was once described as unclimbable, and when you get to the bottom and look, you understand why. But it turns out you can sort of see this in the big photo on the right. There's a bunch of ledges. And so we were able to climb up, and basically we circled almost 360 degrees around the room, actually probably more than 360 when you include the top, following ledges and climbing this. There were, I'd say, 2 really gnarly pitches. And fortunately, Derek really got to do most of those. I drew the longer straw in that case. But this was the same, and this is the same terrible rock I described in the Oz area. So it was quite a climb. It involved a lot of poor rock quality, and it took us it's really about 5.5 days. We had time to survey at the top on the last day. And it might be a little, you probably don't get this impression, but Derek is climbing right here. He's actually cleaning rock flour off the path he's trying to traverse. The final rope is rigged just to his right, just about right here. And that's, I think, 180-foot free drop. So that's what's up above Nick Saki here in the room. That is one of the nicest, prettiest drops in the cave now. But Derek is out above space, above free space, above 180-foot drop. And then I led this next section here where, if I fell, I was on good gear. I wasn't, nothing should fail, but I'm still facing 180 feet of exposure above the PhD room. And this is another view that I think is very rarely seen in pictures of Lechuguilla, so I figured I'd throw it in. I'm about 100 feet off the ground, and what I did is I took a series of photos and stitched them together to create a panorama of the birds, a panorama bird's eye view of the PhD room. So depending on your connection quality, this line right here is orange flagging, more orange flagging. So that's the main trail running through the PhD room. And you can see someone set up, the gear set up right here. So I believe where you come into the PhD room is over here. There's a something called the loft, I think, is a ledge just off the right side. And then obviously my cave pack is hanging in the field of view, but kind of a neat view looking down on a big room. And then, that's all the happy stuff, having fun. I do feel like I have to mention a couple things that need to be said. And so gear is aging. We're leaving it for future generations. And what I've found is just, climbing old ropes in Lechuguilla is scary. And some of the stuff is not aging well. This is an aluminum carabiner on the right that was at the top of a 200-foot rope going up dire straits. And this was weird. It was an old handmade webbing ladder or atria wrapped around a piece of rock glued to the floor by gypsum. That was clipped to the rope, and then the rope was wrapped around the same flake. And directly above that, a few feet back, was just a bomber natural thread which wasn't used. And so this is not my favorite thing to come up to at the top of a climb. And then on the left was another anchor we fixed on a traverse on dire straits. This is a stainless hanger and then a non-stainless bolt head on the right, and then a corroded aluminum carabiner. And so, we've learned over the last 30 years, I hope. And, I try to leave a good anchor at the top of every climb we're not going to pull, and we try to leave it stainless or a good natural. This is what we need to be doing. We should be able to learn lessons from this. And safety aside, this is also impact. We're dropping pieces of metal all over the cave. I have not had an anchor fail yet, but to be honest, I think it's a matter of time when an anchor is going to break on someone climbing old ropes and ledge. The other scary thing that happened was last year on a max trip, we were resurveying up above the Beyond Reason room, and I was going to go up a climb, check the condition, do, resurvey it, do the shot, and I bounce tested the 11 millimeter rope hanging there, and it snapped on the second bounce about 15 feet above me. So this is Sean pointing at the end of the rope's broken right there, and this is a picture of the break on the ground directly below it. This rope, we believe, I think we've tracked to 1988 or 1989. So it's old, but we tend to treat 11 mil rope as indestructible. And this was the wake up call that it's not, and we need to be thinking about it. And so I'd encourage anyone doing this sort of, trying to go up an old rope, really think it through and definitely, bounce test it and make sure your anchor and your rope are good. And, everyone asks me, this must have been on a lip. This was not hanging on a lip. It was hanging in free space.
You have a couple more minutes, James.
Thanks, Hazel. I think I'm one slide from the end. I think Ron Miller's done some testing on this and hopefully is going to talk about that. Impact in October 2019, I did a climb above a delicate flowstone room. There's a significant site for subaqueous lectites directly below this. And there's always been this peculiar brown patch coming down this climb and covering the flowstone below. And I just always assumed it was a natural feature. When I did the climb, I discovered it had been done before, it had not been surveyed, and these pictures are the muddy boot prints that were at the top of this. So this is like 100 feet up. That has now flowed down onto the flowstone in the room and is continuing to cause impact. So, what we do as cavers and climbers continues to have impact into the long term. I think the best I've found is this climb was also done in the late 1980s. And, I would love for this sort of thing to never be left for the future to find again. This is one of the saddest things I've ever seen in Lechuguilla. And sort of, looking towards the future, now I'm thinking there's the right eye of the skull. I did about the first 80 feet of this. There's some directional aragonite. It looks pretty good. And maybe I'll go back and work on that. It's the one climb I haven't finished yet. And I had one sort of parting thought. We tend to climb large leads, but many of the recent discoveries, Emerald City, Neuland, Zion, the Northeaster, were all through overlooked tight squeezes. How many thousands of holes the size of those tight squeezes remain unchecked in the ceilings of Lechuguilla? And with that, I think I'll take questions. Or if we're done, I can exit out and switch over to the next person.
Yeah, I think we only have a minute left here. Let's see if we can do one real quick. And this might be more for cave management, so don't feel pressured to answer this, James. But we had a question in the chat box: is there an ongoing inventory of all the rig gear in Lechuguilla Cave?
So the answer to that is yes. Over the last, I don't know, I want to say since about when Paul, Stan, and Dale redid the plan, they did start keeping a rope log and rigged gear. So it is woefully incomplete on the old stuff, but the new stuff is there's a solid inventory, and whenever we find old anchors, we try to document and pass that back to the park, so it's continuously improved.
Great, thanks so much for that answer. I'll hand it off to the next introduction then.